Well, it's Sunday, February the 10th, and as the crisis in the Commonwealth of Virginia continues, there is a lot of focus on the line of succession there.
So at this point, maybe Virginia should take a cue from the Oscars and just go without a governor this year. You know? Or they could just come full circle and make it Governor Kevin Hart.
Helping me this hour, attorney A. Scott Bolden. He's also the former chair of the Washington, D.C. Democratic Party and the National Bar Association PAC. Catherine Mengu Ward is with me as well. She's the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine. Ilona Minkowski is a senior reporter for Real Vision. And Pete Dominick, to my right, the host of Stand Up on Sirius XM Insight. And I want to start this morning in Virginia. As I said, the two women who have accused the Commonwealth's lieutenant governor of sexual assault have indicated they would testify in impeachment proceedings should he refuse to step down from office. That news in statements from their attorneys. Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax continues to deny the allegations, and he has asked for an investigation. In a new statement, he asks that no one rush to judgment, and he says he wants the public and his accusers to be respected during the process. Well, this is taking place as Ralph Northam, the state's governor, and Virginia's Attorney General Mark Herring, both Democrats, face scandals of their own. A racist photo uncovered in Ralph Northam's medical yearbook. In a new interview, he says he wants to spend the rest of his term focusing on racial equality. Finally, some new data this morning from a Washington Post Schar School poll. Virginia residents are split over what they think should happen to the governor. 47% of those surveyed say he should step down, and 47% say he should stay on. Scott, let me start with you. I know that you were a sex crimes prosecutor in the past before you got into your current line of work as an attorney. I want to read a statement, part of that statement from Justin Fairfax here. He says, I say again without reservation, I did not sexually assault or rape Meredith Watson, Vanessa Tyson, or anyone else. Our American values don't just work when it's convenient. They must be applied at the most difficult of times. As I said yesterday, he calls for this investigation. Calls for the FBI to participate in that, even though I don't think they have jurisdiction in these issues. What should be happening now from a legal perspective in Virginia if he were to get what he wants?
Well, the women have lawyered up. Justin has lawyered up, and he's right to be asking for these investigations. Now, it sounds like that the Senate or the House are going to take it up through some impeachment proceeding, which is really interesting in and of itself because I don't think you can make out an impeachment process based on these allegations alone. And remember, these two women have not made the allegations or filed complaints in either jurisdiction, and they are within the statute of limitations in both of those states. And so what's happening now is they're lawyering up, one, but two, they're investigating themselves, which they should have done before each of them ran for office, but they're investigating themselves and putting a case together both politically and legally. But in the end, it's her word against his word because there aren't any direct witnesses. So you build out from that. There's secondary witnesses who at least one young woman told, and you have to assess the credibility of it and then determine what the political outcome is going to be. And we just don't know that.
On the political outcome, Catherine, I'll turn to you. I mean, it's been a wild week here. We have this interview that Ralph Northam gave the Washington Post, and he describes shuttling between buildings in Richmond through tunnels. He doesn't want to be seen in public. He hasn't spoken since that press conference. He's reading Roots. He's reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' treatise on reparations for African Americans in this country. What do you make of let's start with him, his approach to all of this? He declaring in that interview that he doesn't intend to leave, something he said in an email to Virginia staff as well, and he wants to spend the rest of his tenure here focusing on issues of race in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, I think, people always use the phrase crisis PR like it's something bad, but I feel like what we're seeing in Virginia is what happens when people don't hire good crisis PR to help them out. It is clearly not the right thing to do when you're in the middle of a blackface scandal to say, I'm reading Roots.
Yes. Chapters of it, not the full thing.
And I think, unfortunately, right, I mean, it's pretty long. I think the unfortunate thing here is that mostly people are choosing their sides on this for partisan reasons. And, I think you see that in the poll you just showed where, about half of Virginia's Democrat, about half of Virginia's Republican. And I would guess that those party lines fall out pretty neatly on resign and not resign. So I think there's this game of designated survivor happening right now where if the guy at the end of the line is a Democrat, maybe Democrats are willing to see him fall, but not until they're sure of that. And because Virginia is insane at the moment, they're not sure.
On the insanity, Ilona, I mean, the amount of signatories on these statements asking for the resignations of these three men in high-power positions in Virginia just gets longer and longer and longer. How surprised are you that it's dragged on? I mean, it's been a week, but in light of that it's dragged on.
It feels like a year.
It does.
Doesn't it
Every
always?
week feels like a year these days. I'm not that surprised because I feel like President Donald Trump has very much changed what is considered a political scandal and what isn't these days. We have somebody who's occupying the White House who has multiple allegations of sexual assault against him, and yet he's still there. Same thing with, well, basically racist statements that the president is still making. If you look at this tweet that he put out making fun of Elizabeth Warren, mentioning kind of lightheartedly the Trail of Tears.
In all caps.
In all caps to it, you know. So I think that really sets the standard. And so now Governor Northam is free to just sit it out and say, I'm not going anywhere, because that's the standard that we have in the country now.
Is that true about him, just that he says he's reading Roots in Ta-Nehisi?
Yes, that is true. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would say welcome to 2016
He didn't
with
watch
Ta-Nehisi
it either,
Coates.
apparently,
Roots.
since he's reading the book.
Well, exactly. I mean, like...
Miniseries is better, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Long.
May I suggest Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, you know, things that I've read. I'm a stand-up comic and a radio host. That's the point. You can't say, "Oh, I'm looking into race theory now." It's far too late, and it's inappropriate. And you can't go on a redemption tour now. These are the types of things that you, as a politician, this is the distinction that must be made by your viewers, by my listeners, by the American people. We're not talking about mechanic. We're not talking about even airline pilot. We're talking about governor. With Brett Kavanaugh, we're talking about judge for life. That guy is going to be on the Supreme Court when he looks like the emperor from Empire Strikes Back, still trying to create a Handmaid's Tale America. That's why it matters if you are Justin Fairfax or Governor Northam. We need to make this distinction in our lives as we look past into our own lives and think about what we've done in certain situations, what we've done on Halloween. It's different when you are in the public, when you're a leader, when you're a teacher, when you're a moral leader. These guys should be held by a different standard.
Scott, if I may, why don't you tell us how you really feel? Okay.
It's tiresome.
No, it is tiresome. But, Debbie, let me point out something in regard to the polling that came out. Something like 58% of African Americans
Put this up. We
in
got
Virginia,
this. 58%, yeah.
58% say that they don't want him to resign. And that's not only interesting, it's disappointing, but I think the political dynamic is if all three go, then the Republicans get the seats, or the seats of power. The other thing that's really interesting, I've been talking to business leaders on the ground in Richmond, and there's another dynamic going on. These business leaders, black and white, think that Northam is they're in a better position to control Northam, get more out of Northam as a wounded Democratic governor versus if he wasn't in this scandal. And if he goes, whether it's Fairfax or Herring or the Republicans, that's an unknown quantity. So there's a lot of self-inducement here, or self-aggrandizement, but also a lot of politics where you have race and sex allegations. Politics is still carrying the day.
There's a difference between name-calling and blackface and public policy, extending health insurance like Northam did. Medicaid expansion, which is worse. And we should have that conversation. There should be a distinction about the horrible things we say and do versus the actual policy. So it's been rich and hypocritical to watch Republicans calling for him to step down when they support Donald Trump, Steve King, and everybody else.
And at the same time, I think, right now we're also having a conversation about due process, which it's amazing how being accused of something will suddenly bring to the fore like a deep and abiding respect for due process into, right up until that moment, maybe it was like...
They want it in politics
now.
Well, there's a reason why these women often don't come forward, because they're not going to get due process.
Well, both parties, in theory, should there should be a baseline condition where we respect due process and ask for everyone to, adhere to the standards of the law. But in fact, that isn't how the discussion about Me Too accusations has always gone. No. And, in this case, the blackface scandals obviously are... I don't know that we need to carefully litigate those. We have the photos, but even there, it's like an investigation.
But again, the difference between Kevin Spacey and Bill Cosby and a governor, a president, there needs to be a distinction.
When you look at there's the legal layer, there's the political layer, and then there's the cultural layer as well. And you look through this poll, and buried deep down there was the question about blackface. I was startled, perhaps unreasonably, to see this. 11% of residents of Virginia have either worn blackface or know someone who has. Here we are, 2019, and that was the result of that polling.
I hadn't actually seen that result yet, so I'm with you there, but I don't know. Can you be startled, or should you not be, is the entire point, because the truth is that racism is still very deep-seated in our society, and we see instances of it all over. And so again, it's shocking, but it's not that shocking because we haven't come all that far.
It's reminiscent of, I think, when the first wave of Me Too scandals came out, there were a lot of men that said, who knew this was happening around us? And I think quite a few women said, yeah, obviously this is happening around us. And maybe it's time to have that same conversation about race.
Well, but David, let me just say this. Virginia's not blue yet. And Virginia has a tortured history with race, racism, slavery. It's a Confederate state. And so the northern part of Virginia is very blue, if you will. And the Democratic leadership in the state comes from the northern part. There's a southern part, and there are people in the 80s, 90s, even now. That poll I'm not surprised at because they are aware of it. They may not endorse it, but remember, people that don't look like me, right, they oppose racism, right? But at the same time, it's not the number 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or 5 on their list of what affects them on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to people of color who live it and are reminded every day, whether they make themselves a victim or they go over it or around it and still achieve, or whether they ignore it or protest it. It's very different. And so the challenge here is the New South, Virginia, is still dealing with the old South Virginia and its Confederacy history and its tortured past.
But we don't want to let anybody off the hook, but at the same time, whatever that 11% statistic is, there can be a level of ignorance, and there is, in fact, a level of ignorance in America where you might be paying honor, homage to a black person. Maybe in the 80s you dressed up in a black leather suit and painted your face black and went to a Halloween party as Eddie Murphy because you're a huge Eddie Murphy fan.
Yeah, but you're sounding like you let them off.
No, I'm not, because the important part of what is happening now is I didn't do that because I knew it was wrong then. If there's anybody left in America that doesn't know the horrific history of blackface, you should read a little bit and look into it.
But
these are the painful conversations.
You should read Roots.
But you should have already known. You should have already
look like me, and you've been around that, and you tolerated that. You didn't protest that, right? And yet you say I oppose racism. Then you can't have it both ways. You can't have an environment where it's all white and they do these types of things that are racist and say, oh, that's a buddy of mine, or those are some friends, but I don't support that. But you participate in it by being part of that audience.
But one thing we have to acknowledge too is it bleeds into our political culture in ways that aren't as overt, perhaps, as people putting on blackface and taking a picture of it. But even if you look at the language in the 90s, still today, super predators, right? That the Clintons even espoused. Those are all approaches rhetorically, codes that do apply to kind of racial elements in our society, and they still are happening now within the Republican Party. And so that kind of acceptance is still happening every day.
Why, though? Why?
Yeah, because we haven't acknowledged it.
Why does generational racism continue to exist? You're not born with a racist gene. I'm not born with one. So environmentally, or parents and families are teaching that. That's why you have levels of it every generation. And that's got to stop.
But you so eloquently explain the history of Virginia, but I think the answer is obviously because we haven't acknowledged it. In America right now, we have Confederate statues up.
Reconciliation
yes, we have it. And
we have not had it. And
no, of course we haven't.
We won't get past it until we have those.
In Germany, they have the concentration camps, their museums. Brazil acknowledges their sin of slavery. America right now has statues of Confederates up, not walls, not commemorations of our sinful past. That's what we need to acknowledge, that to have that history to start with.
America just wants to move on without reconciling that history, and you can't move on if you don't.
Cannot.
All right.